So we have some more updates in regards to the Square Enix situation, including some of their sales expectations for their big games like Final Fantasy XVI, FF16 Rebirth, and of course the legendary Foam Stars, and even more details on how they're going to restructure the company moving forward in the next 3 years. This is coming to us from Takashi Machizuki, who is a reporter for Bloomberg, and he breaks down some of what was said internally by Square Enix in regards to all of this information. Starting off first, they say that Final Fantasy XVI sales fell short of expectations. Initial momentum was in line with expectations, but the game failed to reach its goal as its momentum slowed. No updates from sales number last announced at 3 million. He also goes on to say that both FF7 Rebirth and Foam Stars failed to meet their expectations, and their initial momentum didn't reach the internal target that Square had set. However, they are confident that 16 can achieve its goal over the 18-month sales plan that they had set originally, and that sales for Rebirth and Foam Stars weren't necessarily bad. They will go on to reorganize their dev teams into 5 console teams with 1 smartphone game team. And they've relied too much on individual creativity and instead will promote sharing game-making know-how among teams and will seek the best balance of individual creativity and organizational discipline. And for those of you out there who are Dragon Quest fans who are maybe a little bit worried about the situation at Square Enix and how it could affect DQ12, turns out that game is just fine and still under development. So the first thing I want to address is obviously with all of the restructuring going on, inevitably there are going to be layoffs. And this is coming to us from VGC, where they said that Square Enix will in fact lay off people from the US and European divisions of their company, including publishing, IT, and the Square Enix Collective Indie Games label. And this really sucks. There's been so many layoffs over the past year and a half or so within the industry, from Sony to currently Microsoft and now Square Enix, and it just really sucks. And unfortunately, this happens with restructuring. People get laid off, the people at the very top still make their millions, which is really frustrating. And these layoffs are supposed to take place within the next month or so. However, they've already started. There's been a number of people on Twitter who have reported that they have in fact been let go by Square Enix and are looking for work elsewhere. So hopefully the people that were let go are able to land on their feet and find jobs elsewhere. You have so many passionate, talented people within this industry who are not working or being laid off, and it's just really unfortunate that this is happening. And to get to some of those finer details he talks about before we get into the bigger stuff with 16 and Rebirth, splitting up your development teams into 5 teams and having 1 dedicated to smartphone, but also allowing them to share information with each other is really, really great. I think it was even reported recently that CBU3 underwent a name change and they are now Creative Studio 3. So now instead of saying CBU3, I gotta get used to CS3, which sounds kind of cool. Sounds like a Capcom fighting game. But this is something that should happen with all gaming companies. For a lot of Japanese companies, they have all of these internal dev studios that have no communication with one another. And with that changing, that's great. So now the team that works on Rebirth can give information to Creative Studio 3 on their next game. Maybe they had an issue with, a combat thing, or they found a really cool idea for gameplay, and CS3 can then implement that into their game and vice versa. So allowing the teams to communicate, share information and experience is really hopefully going to make these games better and maybe even improve the dev times, because if you have someone that's familiar with a specific issue, maybe they can bounce over to that other team and relay some info that can help them out. So that's a plus. Now, getting to the sales expectations, one thing I have to preface is that under the previous regime at Square Enix with Yosuke Matsuda, Square Enix was notoriously known for having outrageously high sales expectations. Some would even consider them, unrealistically high. A game like Tomb Raider, the reboot, which came out and sold well over 3 million copies in its first month, was deemed a failure by Square Enix, even though those numbers are pretty solid by that game's standards. And it makes me wonder, what were their sales projections for Final Fantasy XVI, because that game came out and sold 3 million copies in its first week of release, which is incredible. But if their sales forecasts were so astronomically high, like maybe they expected it to sell 6-7 million units right out the gate, then of course that's going to make that 3 million look bad, and they're going to consider it a failure. So they really have to figure out how they're adjusting these sales forecasts in a way that they're much more realistic. And they also had to keep in mind Final Fantasy XVI as well as VII Rebirth. These are two massive hero titles for Square Enix launching on one console, a console that has a smaller install base than the PlayStation 4, and I believe the PlayStation 5 attach rate is also lower, which means people bought the console, but they're not necessarily out there buying games to support it. But to kind of go back to that whole 18-month sales plan, which is something that Yoshi P had mentioned in a previous interview, it seems like they were kind of expecting this game to maybe taper off, and it's clear that they had a roadmap of what they were going to do to support this game, including the launch event at the beginning, the game coming out, more info dumps, and then of course the DLC to support the game at a later date. Now, again, they do say that they expect 16 to reach that internal sales figure within that 18-month window, and of course it's going to come out on PC, which should help boost the numbers. I don't know how significant of a boost it will give, but I think it's going to be, at least somewhat decent and helpful. And this is something that I want to point out. I've seen this on my channel recently, and this is all anecdotal based on what my viewers are saying, but I've seen a number of people say that they didn't play 16 or 7 Rebirth because they didn't want to buy a PlayStation 5 just to play those games, and they would much rather wait for the PC releases to come out. So it'll be interesting to see how well a game like 16 and 7 Rebirth do when their PC versions hit. And it's going to be a bit more staggered for 7 Rebirth because there's most likely going to be the Epic Game Store version that comes out first, and then at a later date you'll get the Steam version for 7 Rebirth. That's just kind of how the exclusivity agreements are working out for that game in particular. As for Foam Stars, I gotta be honest, I didn't even realize that game came out, other than the reveal trailer, which did stick with me because it felt more like a we have a Splatoon at home kind of deal. It did have some really great music in the background, very Persona-ish in my opinion. There was that trailer, and then I think one live stream event they did for the game to support it, and that was it. So I didn't even realize that this game was out. I completely forgot. And in regards to marketing, it's kind of interesting because you look at a game like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and that game didn't really have much marketing behind it. And I had speculated in a previous video that maybe they didn't need to do a ton of marketing because it's Final Fantasy VII. Whether people bought the game or not, they're still familiar with the franchise Final Fantasy VII. It's still a pretty popular name. So maybe they were relying too much on the name value alone to get that game out there. And you contrast that to Final Fantasy XVI, which had a massive marketing push. Any single convention that was out there, Final Fantasy XVI was there. If there was a PAX event, you could bet your butt Yoshi P and Michael Christopher Koji Fox were going to be there with the game. Every State of Play or PlayStation Showcase, 16 was there. They had a massive launch event at an amphitheater in California where they invited hundreds of people and streamed it for thousands of people to watch online. And I remember seeing commercials on TV for this game. I would watch Friday Night SmackDown and I would at least see 2 commercials for Final Fantasy XVI. So that game definitely had a much bigger marketing push than, 7 Rebirth did, which I think did help it with that 3 million right in the first week number. And again, all of this restructuring and all of these plans are going to be taking place over the next 3 years. And I do want to touch more on the multi-platform aspect, which we got into on the last video, because I did see a couple of comments say that they think multi-platform is going to be bad for the games in the long run because it will extend the development time for the games. That is 100% true. If you're now making your game for multiple consoles and PC, you're probably adding 5 to maybe 10 months of extra dev time on these games because your base console is PS5, but then you got to make the version on PC and then on Xbox, and then for Remake Part 3, potentially the next Nintendo system. So that will push dev time back. But personally, I think that's a good trade-off. I would much rather wait a little bit longer for that game so that way when it does come out, it can reach even more people on Nintendo, on Xbox, on PC, instead of just that one platform. So I think in the long run, it's a trade-off worth making for the health of the game and for the company overall. And again, multi-platform is key. You look at a company like Capcom, which years ago, many moons ago, they were in a very similar situation that Square Enix is in now. And there were rumors flying around that Capcom at one point was going to file for bankruptcy. They were doing so bad, although I don't think that was ever confirmed, but they were not doing great. The sales for their games were kind of up and down. The quality of their games was also being received up and down. And they had to take a moment to figure things out and restructure the entire company. And they would go on to do that. They would take a game like Monster Hunter, which sold relatively well in Japan on handhelds, and bring it to the console side of things. And they released Monster Hunter World, which did incredibly well. That game did so well that it pretty much revitalized Capcom as a company. And I think to date, Monster Hunter World has sold 25 million units. And again, it's multi-platform. You wouldn't have gotten that number on a handheld or just on a PlayStation alone. You really do need those other ecosystems to invest in these titles to ensure that they can do well from day one. And to date, Monster Hunter as a franchise has topped 100 million units sold for all of their games, with their most recent game, Monster Hunter Rise, selling 15 million units, which is incredibly impressive. And again, a lot of that comes down to the multi-platform things. Accessibility, giving everyone the ability to look at this game or at least consider buying it, which is incredibly important. Another good example is Resident Evil. Now, Resident Evil 6 is the one I'm going to point out here because that game is technically an anomaly. It sold really, really well, but the critical and fan reception to that game was in the pooper. It was not a great game. And they were trying to please so many different audiences, and they had 3 different campaigns. One that was centered on horror with Leon, one that would please the action people with Chris, and then one that had a pursuer enemy with Jake. And it was just trying to do too much for too many different people, and it just didn't work. And Capcom really took that to heart. So what did they do? They revitalized Resident Evil. They stripped away all of the iconic characters, locations, and enemies. They gave us a new protagonist in Ethan, put him in the bayou in Louisiana, and set him off against this crazy, deranged Texas Chainsaw Massacre-esque family in a first-person Resident Evil that really kind of soft rebooted the franchise, and it did really well, not just in terms of sales, but in terms of critical reception. And you look at one of their most recent releases with Resident Evil 4 Remake, which sold over 3 million units in the course of 2 days. And a lot of that is just from that restructuring, really getting your development under control and having all of these teams knowing what they're doing, communicating with one another, and really focusing, again, on quality versus quantity. And now Capcom as a whole is flourishing. Monster Hunter, Resident Evil, Street Fighter has had a resurgence with Street Fighter 6. And they are still doing some experimental stuff on the side with like an Exoprimal, which happens every once in a while. But again, that key here is the restructuring along with that multi-platform focus. And if Square Enix can really get their stuff together, they could approach what Capcom is doing, that Capcom renaissance. You know, they're the Cap gods now. And you can make the argument that maybe Capcom is flirting with the arrogant Capcom era to a degree with some of their statements, but they got the sales numbers to back it up and the success as well. So I really feel like Capcom is going to kind of be the blueprint for Square Enix if Square Enix really wants to get their stuff together and start seeing bigger sales numbers and more success, because I already think that the quality in their product is there. Again, FF7 Rebirth is one of the best games I have ever played, and it quickly became one of my favorite games of all time, which is not an easy thing to do, especially a weird bitch like me who is super nostalgic. A new game to come out and just kind of penetrate that list is not easy to do. And a game like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth deserves to be doing better. Again, I really truly believe that's an incredible, almost once in a generation type of game, and that game should easily be topping 5, 6, 7 million copies sold based on its quality alone. And you can't do that when you're locked down to one platform. With that being said, I am Curious Corduroy. If that is the video, let me know what you guys think in the comments down below about all of this Square Enix news, especially in regards to sales expectations for their hero titles like Final Fantasy XVI, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and the juggernaut that should have been Foam Stars. And also, before you go, check out my most recent video where we dive deeper into that press release from Square Enix, and we do a little bit more talk on the no more exclusives multi-platform focus from Square Enix. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.